The evening sky was turning orange, and the quiet forest outside the human colony was filling with soft shadows. David walked slowly along the narrow dirt path, a bag of supplies hanging from his shoulder. He liked coming here, away from the noise of the colony, away from people who asked too many questions. The forest was peaceful, but sometimes he felt it was hiding secrets. That day, the air felt different. The wind was still, and the birds were silent. David stopped walking, listening. Somewhere ahead, there was a sound. It wasn't the rustle of leaves or the snap of a branch. It was softer, almost like a cry. Curious, he moved off the path, pushing through the thick bushes. His boots sank into damp soil, and the smell of wet moss filled the air. The sound grew clearer. It was a voice. High and trembling, he slowed down, careful not to make too much noise. Then he saw them, in a small clearing, half hidden behind a fallen tree. Were two figures. At first, David thought they were just travelers, but as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he realized they were not human. The taller one was a female, alien, her skin a pale silver blue that caught the last rays of sunlight. She had faint, glowing lines running down her arms, like tiny rivers of light. Beside her was a smaller figure, a little girl, no older than 6 in human years. Her eyes were large and bright, reflecting the light like polished glass. They both looked thin, tired, and scared. The mother had her arm around the child, shielding her from David's view. They were watching him closely, ready to run. David's first thought was to speak, but he remembered how fear worked. Slowly, he set his bag down and reached inside. He pulled out a small package, bread, some dried meat, and a bottle of water. He placed them on the ground in front of him and took 2 steps back. The little girl's eyes fixed on the food, but the mother shook her head and whispered something in a language David didn't understand. Her voice was soft but urgent. The girl stayed still. Clutching the mother's clothing, David pointed to the food and then to them. "It's for you," he said gently. Of course, they didn't understand the words, but maybe they understood. The tone, still, they did not move. He could feel their fear and something else. It was not just fear of him. It was fear of the world beyond the forest. A faint breeze moved the branches above, and David noticed how the mother's eyes kept scanning the trees, like she was expecting something, or someone, to appear. There was tension in her posture, ready to grab her daughter and run. David stayed a little longer, hoping they would take the food. Minutes passed. The girl finally leaned forward, but the mother pulled her back again. Then, very quietly, the mother whispered to her child, and the child whispered something back. David caught only one clear detail when the girl looked at him. Her eyes glowed a little brighter, not like a trick of the light, but like something alive inside them. It was getting darker, and David knew he had to return before nightfall. He gave them one last nod, a slow and calm gesture. Then he turned and walked back toward the path. Behind him, the forest grew even quieter, but in his mind, the image of those two, the alien mother and her glowing-eyed daughter, stayed sharp. As he reached the edge of the forest, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was not just a random meeting. There was a story here, hidden in their silence, and somehow, he knew he would be coming back, not just because he was curious, but because something inside him told him they needed help. Help that no one else would give. Far behind him, in the clearing, the little girl finally reached for the bread. The mother let her take it this time, though her eyes never stopped scanning the trees. She whispered again, but this time David was not there to hear. If he had been, he might have caught a single word in her alien tongue, a word that meant danger. The next morning, David woke earlier than usual. The image of the alien mother and daughter had not left his mind all night. He kept wondering if they had eaten the food, if they were still in that same cold clearing. A part of him told him to forget that it was not his problem. But another part, the stronger part, told him he had already stepped into their world. He packed his bag again, this time adding more than just bread and dried meat. He put in some fresh fruit, a blanket, and a small can of hot soup kept. In a sealed container, the forest was quiet when he entered, the air cool and heavy with mist. His boots left soft prints in the damp ground as he followed the same path as yesterday. When he reached the clearing, he stopped. They were there, just as before. The little girl was sitting on the fallen log, her legs tucked under her. The mother stood close, still watching the trees more than she watched him, but something was different. They didn't try to hide this time. David set his bag down slowly and pulled out the food, placing it on the same spot as yesterday. The little girl's eyes lit up when she saw the fruit. She looked at her mother, waiting for permission. The mother hesitated, but after a moment, she gave a small nod. The girl jumped down from the log and walked toward the food with quick, careful steps. She picked up an apple, turning it in her hands like it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Then she bit into it, juice running down her chin. Her small laugh was quiet, but David heard it, and it made him smile. The mother still didn't eat. Instead, she studied David as if trying to read his intentions. Her eyes were a deep silver. Almost reflecting his face back at him, David met her gaze and gave a small nod. No words could bridge the gap between them yet, but maybe time could. For the next week, David came every day, sometimes in the morning, sometimes in the evening. He brought food, water, and sometimes little things, a scarf for the girl, a small flashlight, a pouch of herbs for the mother. The girl began to greet him with shy waves. And once, she even tried to mimic his words. "David," she said slowly one afternoon, pointing at him. It surprised him so much that he almost dropped the basket he was carrying. He nodded, touching his chest. "Yes, David," she laughed, repeating it again before running back to her mother. Through gestures and simple signs, he learned bits of their story. They had come from far away, their home destroyed in what he guessed was some kind of war. The father was gone, and the mother's eyes would darken whenever the girl mentioned him. They had been hiding here for weeks, maybe months, avoiding both humans and other aliens. David never asked why they avoided the human colony. He could already guess. Not everyone in the colony was kind to strangers, especially ones who looked so different. One afternoon, it rained heavily. David found them sheltering under the same fallen tree, but the water still dripped through the branches. He handed the mother the blanket he had brought. She took it slowly, her fingers brushing his for the first time. Her touch was warm, and for a moment, she held his gaze. It wasn't just gratitude in her eyes. It was trust, a small, fragile trust, but real. Still, there were moments that reminded David they were not safe. Twice, while he visited, the mother suddenly stiffened and motioned for him to be silent. Her eyes scanned the trees, and her body shifted to shield the girl. Once, he thought he heard something too, a faint metallic clink, far away, but when he looked, the forest seemed empty. The little girl seemed to sense things as well. She would sometimes stop playing with the flashlight or fruit and just stare into the trees. Her glowing eyes would brighten slightly, like they were reacting to something unseen. David didn't understand it, but he didn't ask. He had the feeling that some truths were better learned slowly. One evening, as the sky darkened and he prepared to leave, the girl ran up to him. She pressed something into his hand, a small stone. Smooth and pale, he looked at it. Puzzled, she pointed at the stone, then at herself, then at him. A gift, he realized. He smiled, slipping it into his pocket. "Thank you," he said. Even though she probably didn't know the words, but she understood his tone, because she smiled too. As David walked home that night, the forest seemed less empty than before. He was no longer just a man walking through it. He was carrying someone's trust. And though he didn't know it yet, Every visit was pulling him deeper into their lives, deeper into a danger that was already moving toward them. And somewhere beyond the hills, far from the colony, something was searching. It was getting closer, step by step. The rain had stopped, and the forest smelled fresh. David walked carefully along the path, his boots leaving prints in the soft ground. He carried his usual bag of food, but also a notebook and a pencil. He had an idea, if they couldn't speak the same language, maybe they could draw. When he reached the clearing, the little girl was already waiting. She ran to him and took the bag with both hands, her eyes bright with excitement. The mother followed slowly, her silver blue skin glistening with drops of water. She looked tired, as if she hadn't slept all night. Her eyes studied David for a moment before she let herself relax. David sat down on a fallen log and pulled out the notebook. He drew a simple picture, a small stick figure of himself. Then he drew the forest, the path, and the colony. In the distance, the girl laughed and pointed at the figure, saying, "David." He smiled and nodded. Then he turned the pencil toward them. The girl hesitated, but the mother slowly reached for it. She held the pencil like it was something fragile. On the first page, she drew a tall tower with a glowing top. Around it, she drew strange shapes. Maybe buildings, maybe ships. Then she drew fire falling from the sky. The pencil lines grew sharp, the shapes breaking apart. David watched closely. He pointed at the falling fire and made a questioning face. The mother paused, then touched her chest and the girl's head. She tapped the drawing of the broken city and shook her head slowly. Gone. The girl took the pencil next. She drew a smaller figure, probably her father, standing beside them. Then she made an X over him. Her eyes lowered, and for a moment, her glowing light dimmed. David understood enough. Their home had been destroyed, their family broken, but the drawings didn't stop there. The mother added new shapes, tall, thin figures with dark helmets and strange weapons. She pointed at them, and then to the trees around them. "Hunting," she seemed to say. David realized these were the ones she feared. Not humans, but another alien race. He wanted to ask why they had come to this human colony's forest instead of seeking help elsewhere. But her body language gave him the answer. They trusted no one. They had seen too much betrayal. For the next hour, they continued to draw. The mother sketched the mountains beyond the colony, marking a hidden path. She drew symbols that David didn't recognize, circles with lines, strange patterns. When he pointed at one of them, she pressed her finger to her lips. "Secret." The girl interrupted their silent conversation by holding up the stone she had given David days ago. She placed it on the page next to one of the drawn symbols. David realized it wasn't just a random rock. It was part of something bigger. Maybe a key, maybe a marker. Whatever it was, it mattered to them. Before leaving, David drew one last picture. A small house with 3 figures inside. Him, the mother, and the girl. The girl smiled at it instantly, but the mother stared at it for a long time. Her face unreadable. She didn't nod, but she didn't reject it either. That night, as David walked home, the forest felt heavier. Every shadow seemed longer, every sound sharper. He thought about the hunters she had drawn. Tall, thin figures, with weapons, moving through the trees like ghosts. They were real, and he had no reason to doubt her. Then time was running out. When he reached his house, David placed the notebook on the table and studied the drawings again. The destroyed city, the hunters, the hidden path, the strange symbols. It was more than just a story. It was a warning, far away, under the dark canopy of the forest. The mother and daughter sat close together. The girl whispered in her own language. The mother listened, then pulled her close. She looked toward the direction David had gone. Her eyes soft for a moment, but when she heard a distant metallic sound in the trees, her body tensed again. They were still coming. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds. The colony was silent, except for the occasional creak of wood as the wind moved through the houses. David sat at his small table, staring at the open notebook. The drawings of the hunters seemed to stare back at him. He didn't know why, but tonight he couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching him. A faint sound broke the silence, a metallic thud, distant but sharp. It was followed by a low, steady hum. David froze. It was not the sound of a human machine. He had worked near enough colony equipment to know the difference. He grabbed his coat, slung a small flashlight around his neck, and slipped outside. The air was cold. Heavy with the scent of rain still trapped in the soil, he moved quickly toward the forest, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. Every instinct told him not to go, but another instinct told him he had to. The forest was darker than usual. The mist clung to the ground, making each step feel slower. Halfway down the path, he heard it again, the hum, louder this time, and then footsteps, not the soft shuffle of a human. These were heavier, with a faint metallic click after each step. David turned off his flashlight, letting his eyes adjust. He moved quietly toward the clearing where the mother and daughter usually stayed. But when he reached it, they weren't there. Only the cold remains of a small fire sat in the center. His heart started to pound. He whispered their names, though he didn't truly know them. No answer. Then, from deeper in the forest, he heard a voice. It was the mother's, low, urgent. David followed the sound until he saw them crouched behind a fallen tree. The girl was pressed against her mother's side, her eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. When the mother saw him, she shook her head sharply. Holding up her hand for him to stop, David crouched low, moving closer until he was just a few steps away. The mother leaned toward him and whispered a single word in broken English. Hunters, before he could ask anything. The sound of the footsteps grew louder. Through the trees, faint lights appeared. Not lanterns, but thin beams sweeping across the forest floor. David caught sight of a tall, thin figure moving between the trees. It was exactly like her drawings, a dark helmet covering its head, its arms long and mechanical in its hand. It carried a weapon that looked like a cross between a blade and a gun. The mother gestured toward David's back, then toward the hills beyond the path. He understood. She wanted him to lead them somewhere else. Quickly, he motioned for them to follow. They moved slowly at first, careful not to make noise. But when one of the hunters turned its head toward their direction, they began to run. The forest came alive with sound, branches snapping, leaves crunching. David could hear the hunter's footsteps growing closer. He didn't know how many there were, but the shadows moved like there were more than one. The girl stumbled once, but David scooped her up without slowing. Her small arms clung tightly to his neck. They reached a rocky slope, hidden by thick ferns. David had discovered it months ago while exploring. Behind the ferns was the narrow entrance to a cave. He motioned for them to get inside. The mother hesitated, scanning the forest one last time before following. Inside, the air was cold and damp. The cave twisted deeper into the rock, hiding them completely from view. David could hear the hunters outside now, their strange language echoing in the night. The mother held the girl close, one hand covering her mouth to keep her quiet. Minutes passed, but the hunters didn't move away. Their footsteps circled the area, and once, a beam of light swept across the cave entrance. David held his breath, every muscle tense. Finally, after what felt like hours, the sounds faded into the distance. But the tension didn't leave the mother's face. When the forest was silent again, she turned to David and said something in her language. Her voice was soft, almost like she was speaking to herself. Then, with broken English, she added, "Not safe here. Not safe anywhere." David didn't answer. He knew she was right. But as he looked at her and the girl, their faces pale in the dim cave light, he also knew something else. He couldn't walk away now, whatever these hunters wanted. Whatever danger they brought, he would stand between them and these two. No matter the cost, outside, far beyond the cave. The hunters moved silently through the forest. Their search had only just begun. The cave stayed silent for a long time. Only the slow dripping of water from the ceiling broke the stillness. David sat near the entrance. Watching the forest outside, every rustle of leaves made his muscles tighten. The mother sat deeper inside. Holding the girl in her arms, her silver-blue skin looked paler than usual. And her glowing lines were dim. Fear was still written across her face. David knew they couldn't stay there forever. If the hunters had been close tonight, they could be closer tomorrow. The cave had only one entrance, if the hunters found it. There would be no way out when the first light of dawn crept into the cave. David stood and moved outside. The forest was still, but too quiet. Even the birds were silent. It was the kind of silence that made his instincts scream. He signaled for the mother and daughter to follow. They moved quickly, sticking close to the thickest trees. David avoided the main paths, taking side trails and stepping on moss to muffle their footsteps. He carried the girl when her small legs grew tired. She rested her head on his shoulder, her glowing eyes watching the trees as if searching for something unseen. An hour into their journey, the sound came again, a metallic click, followed by a faint hum. David's heart jumped. The mother froze, pressing the girl behind her through the trees. A dark figure appeared, tall and thin, its helmet reflecting the weak sunlight. They were too close to run far. David pointed to a low ridge ahead. They moved as fast as they could, scrambling over rocks and roots. But the hunter had seen them. A sharp sound cut through the air, not a gunshot, but something faster. A beam of pale light struck the tree next to David, splintering the bark. The girl cried out, and the mother grabbed her, pulling her close. David reached into his bag and pulled out a flare stick. He had brought it in case of emergencies. He snapped it open, and a bright red light flared to life. He threw it into the bushes to the left. The sudden glow made the hunter turn its head, giving them a few precious seconds. They climbed over the ridge, sliding down the other side into a narrow gully. The ground here was damp, covered in fallen leaves. David led them through the gully until they reached a cluster of large boulders. He motioned for them to hide behind the biggest one. The mother crouched low, holding the girl close. David pressed himself against the rock, listening. The hunter's footsteps moved along the ridge above. It paused, scanning the area. David could hear a faint clicking sound, as if it was analyzing something. Then another sound joined it, footsteps from the opposite direction. More than one hunter now. David's grip on the rock tightened. If they came down into the gully, there would be no time to run. He picked up a stone and threw it as far as he could toward the east. It landed with a sharp crack. One of the hunters turned toward the sound, moving away. The second followed slowly, their metallic footsteps fading into the distance. David exhaled slowly. The mother's eyes met his. A silent thank you in their gaze. The girl reached out and touched his hand. Her small fingers were warm, and for the first time since he had met them, David felt their fear shift into trust. They stayed hidden until the sun was higher. When it was safe, they continued walking. By the time they reached a shallow stream, the tension in the air had eased slightly. David let the girl play in the water for a few minutes. Her laughter was soft but real. The mother watched with a faint smile. Though her eyes never stopped scanning the trees, David knew they couldn't keep running forever. The hunters were persistent, and sooner or later, they would track them again. As he looked at the two of them, the mother standing guard, the girl splashing water on her feet, he felt something settle in his chest. They weren't just strangers anymore. They were under his protection now, that night. They camped near the edge of the forest, hidden among dense brush. David stayed awake while they slept. In the distance, faint metallic clicks echoed through. The darkness, the hunters were still searching, but as long as David could breathe, they wouldn't find them. Somewhere deep inside, he already knew what he had to do next. Hiding wasn't enough. They needed a real shelter somewhere the hunters couldn't reach, and for that, there was only one choice. Tomorrow, he would ask them to come live with him. The morning was quiet, but it was not peaceful. The forest air felt heavy, as if it was holding its breath. David stood near the stream, filling a small bottle with water behind him. The mother and daughter sat close together on a flat rock. The girl played with the smooth, pale stone she had once given him, rolling it between her glowing fingers. The mother kept her eyes on the trees. Even in this moment of rest, her body was tense. David watched them for a while. He could see the tiredness in the mother's movements. Her shoulders were slightly hunched. Her eyes darker than before. The girl still smiled sometimes. But it was the kind of smile that tried to hide fear. It was clear they could not keep living like this. Not in caves, not under fallen trees. Not running every few days. He walked back to them and crouched down so they could see his face. The girl tilted her head, curious. The mother's gaze sharpened, waiting for him to speak. David pointed at himself, then made a roof shape with his hands. "Home," he said slowly. Then he pointed at both of them and repeated the roof gesture. "Home." "With me," the girl's eyes lit up instantly. She turned to her mother, speaking quickly in their own language, but the mother's reaction was different. Her face tightened and she shook her head. She spoke to David in broken words. "No. Safe." Danger come, David understood, but he didn't look away. He pointed to the trees around them, then shook his head. "Not safe here," he said. Then he tapped his chest. "I can help. I protect." The mother's eyes searched his face for a long moment. Finally, she lowered her gaze. Her hand rested gently on the girl's head, as if weighing the choice in that silence. David saw the truth. It wasn't that she didn't want his help, it was that she feared bringing harm to him. He pulled the notebook from his bag and flipped to a page where he had drawn a small house. 3 figures stood inside him, the mother and the girl. He showed it to them again. The girl reached out and touched the page with her fingertip, smiling. The mother's lips pressed into a thin line, but her eyes softened. Finally, she gave a small nod. It was hesitant, but it was yes. They moved quickly after that. David led them through the forest toward the colony's edge. He took hidden paths, avoiding open spaces. The girl walked beside him, holding his hand. Every so often, the mother looked back, scanning for any sign of the hunters. When they reached the tree line, David stopped. From here, the open land between the forest and his home was visible. It was dangerous, too exposed. But they didn't have another choice. He crouched down and pointed toward a narrow trench that cut across the field. They could use it for cover. They moved in quick bursts, from trench to bush, from bush to fence. The colony was just waking up, and a few people outside didn't notice them slip past. David's home sat on the far edge, small but sturdy. He unlocked the door and motioned them inside. The mother hesitated on the threshold, her eyes scanning the room as if checking for traps. The girl, however, ran straight to the table and touched the wooden surface with both hands. Her smile was wide, and for the first time, David heard her laugh fully, a bright, pure sound. He closed the door and set down his bag. "This is home now," he said softly. Even if they didn't understand the words, the mother looked at him for a long moment, then gave a slow, almost invisible nod. The rest of the day was quiet. David showed them where they could sleep, the small room in the back with a bed big enough for 2. He brought extra blankets, food, and a pitcher of water. The girl curled up under the blanket almost immediately, her glowing eyes dimming as she drifted off. The mother stayed awake, sitting by the window. David knew she was still listening. for footsteps that might never come. That night, as the moon rose, David stood outside for a while. The air was cool, and the colony lights glowed faintly in the distance. He knew bringing them here was risky. If the hunters came, his home would be their first stop. But when he thought of the girl's laugh and the mother's quiet nod, he knew it was the right choice. Inside. The girl murmured in her sleep. The mother whispered something in her own language. David didn't understand the words, but he didn't need to. The tone was enough. It was the sound of someone who had finally, even just for one night, found a place to rest, far away. In the darkness beyond the forest, the hunters moved in. Silence. Their sensors picked up faint traces of movement from earlier that day. They adjusted their path toward the colony. The game was not over. The first days in David's home passed in a quiet rhythm. The mother and daughter stayed mostly inside, moving softly, speaking in low voices. The girl explored every corner, the old bookshelf, the small kitchen, the worn armchair by the window. Sometimes she would bring David little things she found, like a button or a coin, holding them out like treasures. Her laughter began to fill the small house. It was a new sound, and David found himself listening for it every morning. The mother was slower to relax. She cleaned the space around her, folded the blankets neatly, and always kept her eyes on the door. David noticed she would pause sometimes, listening as if she could hear something far away. He never asked, but he knew she was still waiting for danger. One afternoon, David decided to take them into the garden behind his house. The high wooden fence made it safe from prying eyes. The girl walked barefoot in the grass, chasing a small yellow butterfly. Her glowing eyes followed it with wonder. The mother sat on a bench, the sunlight catching the silver blue of her skin. For the first time, David saw her expression soften. Without hesitation, she looked. Almost peaceful, they began to fall into a routine. David would leave for a few hours each day to work and gather supplies. The mother and daughter stayed inside, but they would watch for him through the window. When he returned, the girl would run to the door, her small feet pattering on the wooden floor. Once, she surprised him by saying his name clearly, David, and laughing as he lifted her into the air. But even in this fragile calm, small warnings appeared. One night, mother woke David with a quiet knock on his bedroom door. When he stepped into the hallway, she pointed to the window outside. The garden was bathed in pale moonlight, and the fence's gate was slightly open. David checked the yard, but found nothing. Still, he locked the gate and placed a heavy chair in front of the back door the next day. He spoke to one of his few trusted neighbors, an older man named Rook. Rook didn't ask many questions, but he knew how to keep watch. David asked him to look out for strangers near the edge of the colony. Rook agreed, his eyes narrowing as if he already suspected something. Days later, David returned home earlier than usual. As he approached his house, he saw the mother standing at the window when she spotted him. Relief washed over her face. She opened the door quickly, pulling him inside. The girl sat on the couch, clutching the pale stone tightly in her hands. The mother spoke quickly in her language, pointing toward the forest. David didn't understand the words, but he understood the fear. That night, the three of them stayed in the living room, the mother and daughter curled under blankets. David sat by the front door with a lantern beside him. Outside, the colony was quiet, but his mind kept replaying the hunter's metallic footsteps. He didn't sleep in the morning. The mother handed him the stone. She pressed it into his palm and closed his fingers around it. Her eyes were serious, almost pleading. The girl watched silently, her glowing eyes reflecting the light. David didn't know why this stone mattered so much, but he felt its weight, not just in his hand, but in his responsibility. By the end of the week, the neighbors had noticed the change in David's home. Some were curious, others suspicious. He heard whispers in the market, strangers, refugees, dangerous trouble. David ignored them, but he knew rumors could spread faster than truth. Despite the tension, the bond between the three grew stronger. The girl began to mimic more of David's words. She laughed more freely, sometimes even teasing him by hiding his tools. The mother spoke to him in short phrases, learning slowly. One evening, she said something that made him stop in his tracks. "Family," she said softly, pointing at the three of them. David didn't need any other word, but the peace didn't. Late one night, Rook came to his door. "There's movement in the forest." "Ah," he said in a low voice, "not animals. Too quiet, too deliberate." David felt a cold weight settle in his chest after Rook left. David closed and bolted every door and window. The mother understood without explanation. She moved the girl into the back room, her glowing eyes wide but silent. David sat in the dark near the front window, watching, listening. Far in the distance, past the tree line, faint lights flickered, not torches, not human lanterns, but narrow beams cutting through the mist. The hunters had found the trail again, and this time they were closer than ever. David tightened his grip on the stone in his pocket. The mother's earlier word echoed in his mind, family. He wasn't going to lose them, not to the forest. Not to the hunters, not to anyone far beyond the colony. A small alien ship settled silently into the shadows of the trees. The game was no longer about hiding. It was about who would make the first move.